South Africa's economy grew by 0.4% in Q1 2023, but there are concerns it may contract by 0.1% this year. The FirstRand Group, in its trading update for the 6 months ending on June 30, 2023, expressed worries about the global economic slowdown caused by the increased inflation levels leading to a rise in interest rates. The country's macroeconomic environment in the first half of 2023 was worse than expected, with challenges like load shedding, inflation and high interest rates impacting the economy. So joining me to discuss this, I have Hugo, Pieneer, Chief Economist, Bureau for Economic Research. He's actually joining us from Cape Town, South Africa. You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Or good morning, I think, where you are.
Of course, we're still in the morning. Now, the FirstRand Group has said that South African macroeconomic environment for the first 6 months of the year 2023 is far worse than what was initially expected. So what are the factors responsible for this?
So I'm not actually sure that is 100% right. So in the first quarter let me first say the outlook is poor. I think nobody disagrees with that. But you mentioned the economy grew by 0.4% in the first quarter. Now, there were many people who thought that the economy would actually contract in the first quarter after a fairly large contraction in the fourth quarter of last year. So that would, of course, have pushed us into a technical recession. That did not happen. So we got some growth in the first quarter. And then there were real concerns that in the second quarter that the economy could contract, and that was mainly because of severe levels of load shedding or power cuts in South Africa, or let me say the fear that we would have severe power cuts during our winter months. But as it turned out, there was a surprising reprieve on power cuts in the month of June. So I must say, I very much doubt whether we're going to see a contraction in the second quarter. It still means growth on a year-on-year basis is quite poor. But if anything, I think relative to some expectations at the start of the year, the first of the year may actually turn out to be somewhat better than generally thought.
All right, just as you have said that there were expectations that there could have been contraction in the first half of the year, but there wasn't. Now, would you attribute that to the efforts of the government in terms of policies, or would you say that it's just something that didn't happen? Probably the South African economy was more resilient enough to weather the storm at that time.
Yeah, so there's a lot of debate about the resilience of the economy against the severe power cuts. Now, I think there's some of that going on. But then there were also some technicalities or let me not say technicalities, there were some bounce back effects in the first quarter of this year from the weakness we saw in Q4 last year. Just one example, we had severe problems on exports in Q4. There was a strike in the state-owned railway company, Transnet, and there was also a derailment on one of our major coal export lines. Now, of course, that did not repeat in the first quarter of this year, so our exports bounced back. And then there was also a sort of an odd very large decline in the financial sector in Q4. That also bounced back in Q1. So there were some specific factors. And then, as I mentioned, in the second quarter, I think we were pleasantly surprised that the power cuts were not more severe. But let me say, I think we're probably postponing some of the weakness, because at the start of the third quarter, where we sit now, some of the intensity of power cuts have returned. So we may well see another negative quarter in the second half of the year. But I think the bottom line here is that the South African economy, in broad strokes, is probably going to grow by between 0 and 0.5%. For the full year 2023, which of course is a very poor growth number. So we don't think the economy will contract for the full year, but even if it doesn't, 0 to 0.5, as I say, is not something to be excited about, not at all.
But as we see it, FirstRand is the first major local institution to predict that a contraction in South Africa's GDP will happen in 2023. But then there are also growing concerns in the aspect of these growths and, of course, the prospects that it will be very low, according to some other school of thoughts. There are some bank institutions and financial institutions that say that there probably might just be some bit of economic growth. So if you say there won't be a contraction or probably zero GDP growth, where do you actually stand? Is there any glimmer of hope that there could be a slight hope of growth, whether it's 0.5, whether it's 0.1%, whatever the case may be, and that could also give an impetus or some sort of confidence to investors within the South African economy?
Well, once again, whether we grow by 0% or 0.5, I don't think any of those numbers will give particularly or particular confidence. It is, of course, better to grow at 0.5 than to contract by 0.5. So where do we sit? Well, we're in the camp that says the economy may grow by around 0.5% this year. Again, I'm not jumping up and down about that. I still think that is quite a poor number, but at least it's not a full-out contraction. So where's the hope? I think the hope in South Africa is very much on the renewable energy side. So we're starting to see a number of projects coming to fruition. That is boosting private fixed investment in South Africa. And over time, once these investments get done and those additional energy megawatts are connected to the grid, we should move to a situation where the economy is less constrained by these power cuts. There are also a number of the Eskom, so this is the state power utility in South Africa, a number of their large units are out for prolonged maintenance issues, but those should also start to come back next year. So I think if one takes, as an investor, if you take a 12-month view on South Africa, things should start to look up quite a bit. Again, we're not talking about 3-4% growth here, but you're probably talking about an economy that goes from sort of stall speed towards 1.5-2% growth in 2024, and perhaps more so going into 2025. Although it's quite a long time to look forward to 2025, but I think you can start to tell a more optimistic story on a 12-18-month view for South Africa.
All right. Away from that, there's been so much talk about South Africa's stance on the ongoing Russia-Ukraine crisis and the potential impact it would have, or it is already having, on the South African economy. Do you also have such fears? And what do you think the impact would be based on the fallout with the West, of course, if there is a friction between the US and South Africa, based on the kind of relationship that South Africa has with Russia?
Yeah, so I mean, it's sort of another own goal, unfortunately, that we've struck in the last couple of months. So the US, we should not forget, the US is an important trading partner for South Africa, much more so than the Russian economy. So of course, China is a different story. China and the US is largely on par in terms of export markets for South Africa. So we need to be very careful here in terms of diplomacy towards the US. Look, there's a specific risk here, and that has to do with the AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act. Beneficial trade access that we get, or that parts of the South African economy get in the US. There is some concerns that if we don't change tact, that the US may decide to exclude us from this trade agreement, and that of course will have some adverse impacts on specific sectors in the economy. It's not a foregone conclusion, but that would be the risk. In terms of near-term risk, I guess the upcoming BRICS summit in August in South Africa is a particular date to flag, because the question is whether Mr. Putin from Russia would in person attend that summit. If he does, it makes life very difficult for the South African government, because then under the Rome Statute, statute, of the International Criminal Court, we are obliged to arrest Mr. Putin. So there are now behind the scenes talks going on to prevent Mr. Putin from actually coming. But so you are right. There are certainly risks surrounding our diplomatic stance towards Russia.
All right, still talking about this diplomatic stance and how it would affect South Africa's trade with the West. Would you advise the South African government to take a stance to speak for or against Russia's onslaught in Ukraine? Just to take a stand.
Look, not that I have much influence on government policy, but certainly yes. I think that would be the sensible thing to do. I mean, if one thinks about it, the South African economy is also being negatively affected, or has been negatively affected by the invasion. If one thinks what happened to energy prices last year, what happened to food prices. Now, we are fortunate in the sense that our domestic crops on the grain side are actually holding up quite nicely. But even so, with these global prices going up, there's no doubt that it had an impact on domestic inflation, and for that matter, on domestic interest rates. So our economy is also being hurt by these events.
All right, let's go back to the issue of power crisis and load shedding as it is now. We know that it has debilitated South African businesses very severely. Now, is there hope that there's a hope in sight? Are there palliatives or some sort of solution in sight that could help the South African government deal with this power crisis? Are there other areas that the South African government is not actually looking towards a solution to dealing with the issue of power generation for South African businesses?
Look, I think this is very much actually a private-driven solution as opposed to a government-driven one. But let me just caveat that statement to say that last year we had probably the biggest energy market reform in 25 years in South Africa, where the government opened up the private sector generation market to say that individuals, businesses in particular, no longer need a license before they can generate their own power. So this reform opened up a lot of opportunities for private sector investment into renewables. And now we're talking about wind and solar, of course, particularly solar if you talk about individual households and smaller businesses. So the government has played its role. But now it is the private sector that's sort of taking up the baton here and starting to use this reform to invest a lot more in, as I say, private sector energy generation. So yes, as I mentioned earlier, I think there certainly is hope, and the hope is that companies are almost isolating themselves from this power crisis by putting up solar installations, using diesel generators, although that comes at an exorbitant cost. But so I think one can start to tell a story that the economy is becoming more resilient against these power cuts and will become even more so as we move into the future.
All right, moving on now. The inflation rate for consumer prices in South Africa moved over the past 62 years between 0.7% and 18.7%, according to reports. So would you say it's fair when you compare it with other countries like Nigeria that had risen to about 22.79%?
Well, no, I think the inflation environment is certainly different. So, I mean, the one positive that we've always had in South Africa is well, let me not say always, but certainly for the last 25 years, is a fiercely independent central bank that has an inflation targeting mandate and that sticks to that mandate very diligently. So we just earlier this morning had the CPI data come out for the month of June. So that was an increase of 5.4%. Year on year. Our Reserve Bank has a target to keep headline CPI between 3% and 6%, but they prefer it to be around the midpoint of that target, i.e. around 4.5%. So at 5.4 in June, we are of course still above that target, but we are moving towards that target. So, I mean, I don't know a hell of a lot about the inflation dynamics in Nigeria, but I would argue that it's a totally different story. I mean, we tend to not have, certainly not in recent years, the type of price pressures in many that we see in many other parts of the continent.
All right, thank you so much, Hugo Pieneer, Chief Economist, Bureau for Economic Research, for talking to us this morning.
My pleasure.